Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. Give a few minutes before we can start, inshallah ta'ala. Wait a couple more minutes. I hope everyone got the notifications that we will start at 9 today instead of our time of 7. And maybe in going forward, we might just do this at like this time because it is a little easier for me on Fridays. Inshallah, we just see what's cool for the people. If 7 to 8 is good, um, we'll just stay with that. But of course, in the fall when the time goes back, we have to switch the time again. So but alhamdulillah, Islam is all about adjustment. Okay, Tayyip, it's just now 9 o'clock. Um, let's see if anybody joins. Uh, you're hearing these sounds in the background. Please disregard them. I'm taping this from home and I'm in the hood, so you hear stuff from inside and out at any given time. So, all right, it's 9 o'clock. So, if I can be on time, then people can be on time. So, inshallah, we'll begin. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In alhamdulillah wa kafa. والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا وحبيبنا المصطفى محمد بن عبد الله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين وبعد. Okay, so I'd like to welcome you all to this class that we've entitled Friday Night Lights, and the purpose of this class is that we will be discussing some spiritual discourses, inshallah ta'ala. This is our second class in the series, and last week we spoke about the origins of Tasawwuf. What is Tasawwuf? That's a word that's a dreaded word amongst people today, and but it's something. Excuse me, alhamdulillah. It's something that we really have to explore because Tasawwuf is the science of the soul. So, just a quick review for those who may not have reviewed the class from last week. All right, so we going to just go from review. We said that we talked about the science of Tasawwuf. All right. So what was this? What is it? Its origins, its essence, and we discussed a number of things that it's the science of purifying the soul, nourishment for the soul, and the ayah that we gave from the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Wa yas'alunaka 'anir ruh. Qul ar-ruhu min amri rabbi. Wa ma utitum min al-ilm illa qalil." Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, they ask you about Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, about the soul. And he said to say, the soul, he said, the soul, the command of it is from my Lord. And what you have been given of it, of knowledge, is just a little. All right. So that's the origin about the importance of the soul. We talked about its origins, where does this term tasawwuf come from? Because there are some people who dread this term. When you say Sufism, there's a raised flag, but it has origins that we mentioned last week. One of the origins is that according to one hadith we related, it said that Prophet Musa alayhi salam, that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke to him, he was wearing woolen garments, and that they were known as suf. The woolen garments is known as suf, right? There's another hadith we related about the word, the term, excuse me, The term Tasawwuf coming from Safwa, which means purity. And then there's another narration that the term Tasawwuf comes from the Ahl Sufa. The Ahl Sufa are those companions or those people that used to stay at the masjid of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It was kind of similar to like a boarding house, and those are the people who used to write down hadith and just learn mannerisms from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the most notable of them that we know is Abu Huraira, and then there's also that its origins is that it comes from the word saf, which means rows, arranging rows and ranks, as mentioned in the same surah in the Quran, surah to saf. All right, so there are a number origins about the term tasawwuf, and the reason that it's important because we mentioned you have elements today who will say that tasawwuf is not from Islam, that it's a bid'ah, even so going far to say that it's shirk and all this kind of nonsense. But tasawwuf is just like any of the sciences of tafsir and tajweed and tawheed. All of these are legitimate sciences in Islam, and they were never names of any sciences during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ didn't sit around and teach this concept called tawheed, but he called to the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He didn't teach this concept called tajweed, but he recited to the companions and they memorized what he recited. They knew letter for letter, word for word, and it wasn't called tajweed at the time. That was a term that came later. The same thing with tafsir. All of the sciences are terms that came later, but they were sciences that exist during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And the same thing with tasawwuf, the science of purifying the soul, and everything connected with it. It was during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So it has its origins in Islam, and there's something we should be very wary of, because some of these things, we're not here to attack people, but some of these things we have to make clarifications on, because we're living in a time and we're living around the people who are, clearly countering some of these concepts, and there are people who don't know, and they might be inclined to it, so they'll tell you that Sufism is bid'ah, that it's haram, the Prophet ﷺ didn't do it. And there's this thing that's common where people will say, if the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahabas didn't do it, then that's what we stop too. And in essence, that's true. But the Prophet ﷺ did not say in any hadith that everything that I do, you do, and everything that I don't do, you don't do. He didn't say that. He said whatever he commanded you to do, you do of it as much as you can, and whatever he forbade you from, you stay away from it. So he didn't restrict us to just do everything he did and don't do everything that he didn't do. Because if that was the case, then the Sahabas would have been the first one to understand that like that, and they didn't understand that like that. Because there's plenty of examples that we can bring about the Sahabas doing things that the Prophet ﷺ did not show them or teach them to do, and they did them anyway, So technically they'd be considered a bid'ah, and that's a whole nother argument. Maybe we'll cover it in another class. But the thing is, tasawwuf has its origin with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so before we continue on, we just want to give some more clarification from Imam An-Nawawi, one of the greatest imams of the Ummah. He mentioned something, what is tasawwuf? Because, there are a lot of people nowadays that when you mention tasawwuf, they start thinking about, people, supposedly floating on carpets or sitting in the masjid or in the room in the dark saying hua, 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 or doing what they call swirling dervishes, and a bunch of, and some of the people who are staunch critics of the science, they will take some of the distortions that rightfully have occurred in the science of tasawwuf, and they will present that as what tasawwuf is itself. And that's just dishonesty. That's just dishonesty. All right. So for instance, you'll read about some people who will write about some of these extreme Sufis who would go into a state of like fana, which is a term in the science of tasawwuf, and they would like annihilate themselves, and reports about people going into a state of ecstasy where, where it's reported they would cut their penises off. And this is extremism, not something definitely not approved of by the Sharia, because Tasawwuf has to be in line with Islamic law, the Sharia, because it's haram to mutilate yourself. So now we have to find a balance between some of these extremities in the science of Tasawwuf and some of the people who deny it altogether. So this is one of the purposes of this class, to examine the science, because it is the science that we really need. It's the one that we've been missing for a long time. So Imam Nawawi said basically what are the elements of Tasawwuf. He mentioned 5 things. The first one is to keep the presence of Allah in your heart in public and private. Keep the presence of Allah in your heart in public and private. The second thing, to follow the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam by actions and speech. The third thing is to keep away from people and from asking them to try to be independent. Number 4, to be happy with what Allah gave you, even if it's not a lot, even if it's less. And the 5th one is to always refer your matters to Allah. So this is a process that it takes for the person, who has entered into Islam and is trying to elevate. And we also mentioned that one of these synonyms for the word tasawwuf is ihsan. And we have the word ihsan in the hadith of Jibril alayhi salam, where, when the angel Jibril came to the Prophet ﷺ and he asked him what was ihsan. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, it is to worship Allah as though you see him. And although you don't see him, then verily he sees you. All right. So these 5 points that we didn't mention last week, but I just want to give some more clarification for people to know what tasawwuf is. All right. Because as we cover it, you want to become more comfortable, and you have some, ammunition for when you talk about it, you're talking about it from the proper perspective, inshallah. All right. So now we will move on. So now when we talk about purifying the soul and the obligation that we have, we already mentioned the ayah when it says that we've been given a little knowledge about the soul. So the soul in our body is like, the ice glacier in the water. You only see the top part, but beneath there's a whole nother world. So the soul has degrees, and we need to identify the degrees of the soul so we know how to purify, because it's necessary, and it's not easy. And it doesn't just become standard because we accepted Islam, and it's not standard because we've decided to give up sins. And it's not standard that we decided to change our behavior. And it's not standard that we don't do the same things that we used to do. There's a whole process. The soul needs nourishment to grow, just like you wouldn't water your grass one time, and expect it to grow. You have to keep watering, you have to cultivate it. You wouldn't just eat one meal and expect your body to be nourished, So the same thing with the soul. You can't do one thing or a couple things and think that you've arrived. No, this thing is an ongoing process of nourishment, inshallah. So we want to examine the degrees and identification of the levels of the soul, all right? So the first one is there's 7 that we cover in this particular part of the class. So the inciting soul, the reproachful soul, the inspired soul, the serene soul, the contented soul, the soul that's found pleasing, and the perfect soul. So these 7 degrees we're going to explore in this course. And tonight, inshallah, we're only going to cover the first 3. All right, because I don't want to make these classes too long and overbearing, and since there's not a lot of people, inshallah, to catch on, they're not going live. When they go to recordings, they're not spending a lot of time doing it. Although something like this requires a lot of time and effort for us to learn about it, inshallah. All right. So when we talk about the insightful soul, it's the part is called an-nafsul al-amara. All right. That part of the soul that becomes impure because of its inclination to its material nature. That when the soul is at this level, at this degree, it finds rest and appetite. So anything that satisfies it, they will be inclined to it. And when it is incited, it joins the ranks of animals. So A person, it is very possible that a person, when a person is messed up, they, they even have, certain saying, like a dog, and, a person behave like an animal, there's some correlation there. And then when the soul is at this level, the praiseworthy traits that it had are turned into blameworthy ones. And this degree of the soul has attributes. There's a level of ignorance and avarice, greed, arrogance, irascibility, gluttony, lust, resentful envy, distraction, bad character, minding other people's business, mockery, hatred, and injurious behavior. So you see there are a lot of attributes that a person has to overcome at this level. So this is the first degree, the soul, the amara means something that commands you to do something. It's calling to you, it's speaking to you, in New Jack City, with Christopher Pookie. He said, it just be calling me, calling me. You got to answer. Those vices, those caprices, they just be calling us, calling us. And if we're not in the position to purify the soul, or at least identify the degrees of it, that thing call us and we'll be answering. We'll respond to, whatever causes the greed and arrogance, all of these traits. So a proof of this in the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Inna nafsa le'amaratun bin su'i illa ma rahima rabbi. Say, indeed, the soul is a persistent enjoiner of evil. It commands you to evil except those upon which my Lord has mercy on. So this was the statement of the King Aziz's wife, who tried to seduce Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam. And she, if you know the story, you should be familiar with the story of Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, the 12th surah in the Quran, one of the greatest stories in the Quran and one of the greatest stories of all time, and how she seduced him. And, when she came to the women of her town, and they said she lost her mind, because the soul had whispered to her and was commanding her to do something because, we know the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, they said that he contained in his face half of the world's beauty. So, it was lust, that part of the soul was calling her to want to try to seduce Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam. So this in here, nafsul amara, all right? So the insightful soul. So here you should remember where you can find this example of the insightful soul in Surah Yusuf, ayah 53. And you should know some of these attributes, And when you know these, you're talking about identifying them in your own self. Do a self-assessment test on your soul. How much is your soul inclined to ignorance and avarice, greed, arrogance, all of these, minding people's business, having bad characters. All of these things apply to all of us on some level. Distraction, mockery, hatred, injurious behavior, injurious behavior, whether with the tongue or physically with the limbs. How many times we've said things to people and we didn't think about the impact of the words, and they're words that you can't take back once they're out in the universe, So we have to identify these things, as we mentioned, these degrees of the soul, and identify where we are with respect to our own selves. All right. All right. So, your soul is your worst enemy. All right. So look at these statements right here from some of the ulama of the past. This is related by Tabari. He related to Hassan al-Basri, who was from the 1st century of the Salaf. And it says that he is the father of many of the Turuk, many of the paths of Tasawwuf, they can be traced right back to him. And I can't remember, escapes my mind, but he actually, I think he grew up in the presence of one of the students of the Sahabas. So I can't remember. So here's a statement that's attributed to Al-Hassan al-Basri. He says, your enemy is not the one you are relieved from if you killed him. Rather, your true enemy is your own soul between your two sides. And that's a deep statement, because just imagine if you have an enemy and if you killed them, then that's the end of it. Ain't no more beef, ain't nothing else. But you can't kill your soul. You can't kill your soul. And that is your true enemy, the one that you neglect to fight. the one that we neglect to fight on many occasions, the one that is nafsul amara, that's calling us to all of those traits, and a lot of times we're falling into them. Because if you ever notice, sometimes we as Muslims, we'll be given to all types of vices, all types of caprices, all types of shortcomings. And while we know better, that there's something to that. And it's because this degree of the soul, we're still there at that part, and we haven't elevated because we haven't been able to properly identify these vices. The uyub is called uyub an-nafs, the defects of the soul. All right. So not only does the soul has hundreds of defects, then there's levels to each one of those defects. So then it is said, another statement. He said, the Tabari added, after he said this statement from Hassan al-Basri, he said, it is the jihad against the greatest of enemies to a man. He said, there is no doubt that it is greater in reward to Allah than the jihad against the people of idolatry. All right. So imagine this, nowadays we hear a lot of people talking about the kuffar, they're mushriks, they're this, and yet our own soul is worse than the people who don't say La ilaha illallah. So how much more do we have to fight our own selves? And many times, 99.9% of the times, the things that we are subjected to, we are in our own way. And the first thing that we don't usually don't recognize is that it was us. And we should always take that as a default position. It was me all the time. No matter what happened, what somebody did, it started with me and the enemy that I refused to stand against, And as a result, that enemy used me in another battle to make them victorious, and I lose, So he said the jihad against the greatest enemies to a man is the soul, and it's worse than, it is greater than fighting the kuffar. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us mighty in fighting our own selves. All right. So the next degree that we mentioned is called the reproachful soul. And the reproachful soul is called a nafsu al-lawama. So the nafsu al-lawama is the next degree after the amara, the soul that is insightful, calling you to things, insightful, to rouse you up. So the reproachful soul, some of its characteristics, it says it has some traces of the insightful soul in it. So when you get to this level, you're getting rid of some of those other traits. But it has the ability at this level to acknowledge truth is truth and falsehood is falsehood. So it recognizes its attributes as blameworthy. So, just imagine how many people at the lower level, many of us, we're not even able to recognize how some of these vices are taking over us. At least at this soul, after some training and some nourishment and some cultivation, at least you start to recognize what you're doing is wrong. So you don't, like nowadays, you don't glorify it, you don't make it popular. You don't put it on social media, with a caption, I'm doing me and I'm just keeping it 100. No, this stuff, we have to recognize truth is truth and falsehood is falsehood, and when you have blameworthy attributes, when you're able to recognize them, you're not proud of them, so there's never a thing. Imagine how many Muslims we see are proud of their sins, and this soul, when we reach the level, it has the ability to perform good actions in night prayer, but they are contaminated with conceit and secret ostentation. We want somebody to know that we're doing good, because if we came from the first stage, look how many things we were faced with, all of those vices, all of those defects. So we get to the next stage, and this is the natural inclination. You get over, just imagine, someone who uses drugs and they finally become clean. They happy they become clean, and they want people to know that, that they've reached the goal, but secretly they want to be recognized. That's the next thing it's saying. So it's some more traits of the reproachful soul, that it conceals good actions and acts for Allah. They don't let people know what they're doing, but they love when others find out about the good actions. They love to be praised and lauded for its acts. And although the person at this stage, they recognize this in themselves, they do detest it, But because they are still caught in the other defects, they are unable to remove entirely from the heart. So this is a natural inclination, to, you do something good, you want people to know, you want to be recognized for your good works, especially if you've been in a low state, and all of us have been at the insightful soul stage, you overcome some of that stuff. Yeah, you want to be recognized for your accomplishments. This is part of the human nature. But when you come to this, so you're doing a little better, but then there's still a ways to go in purifying the soul. There's still a long way to go. You're able to recognize truth as truth and falsehood as falsehood. You even have the ability to do some extra nawafil acts, tahajjud, fasting outside of Ramadan. But then, some things, you have to be careful. And these are all methods of how to check yourself, you know. So you keep the good actions for Allah, but if somebody finds out, you don't take the extra step to make sure people don't find out. As to when you get to higher levels, you don't want anybody to know what you're doing. The Prophet ﷺ said that when you give charity, it's like the right hand doesn't know what the left hand gives. Or vice versa, how the hadith goes. And that if somebody praises you, it goes to your head, and that's the part you got to be, careful. And then that you really is not right, so you have to learn how to way to deflect it. And the Sahaba, they're remarkable. It said that they used to say, when people used to give them praise, and they used to say, "May Allah make me better than what you say, and may He forgive me for what you don't know." And then there are other reports that said they used to say, that if you knew about me what I knew about myself, you would throw dirt in my face. Wow. The Sahabas, so just imagine us, the stuff we know about ourselves, but we don't even care. Then somebody was to throw dirt in our face because they knew it about us, we ready to scrap. That's the whole difference of how much work we got to do, So a person, they are unable to remove it entirely from their heart, but they just keep working, to get to the next stage, inshallah. All right. So you should know some of these traits of nafsul lawama. All right. So then when we talk about the nafsul lawama, there's more work that needs to be done. So this is mentions in the Quran where Allah says, "Wala uqsimu bin nafsil lawama." So this is where the term comes from in the Quran. And I swear, meaning Allah, by the reproaching soul. So if you think about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He swears by something in the Quran, and that Allah swears something by the Quran, and the final thing that He gets to, that means that there is no doubt about this thing. So if you go to Surah Qiyamah, let me pull out that real quick. Just the first few ayats. Give me 1 second. So in Qiyamah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the first ayah says, "La uqsimu bi yawm al-qiyamah, wa la uqsimu bi nafsin lawama." And then He says, "Ayahsabu al-insanu alan tajma'a idama." So He says, does not man think that we cannot assemble him from his fingerprints? What's the translation they give here? Not fingerprint, I'm sorry. Man does not think we will not assemble his bones. Then He says, Bella, Qadirina, Ala and Tusawiya banana. Yes, we are able to do that even down to his fingertips. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is swearing by all of these things, but He swears by the reproaching soul. So now if you think about this reproaching soul, why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala swear? Why did He just say by the soul that He created, right? As He said in other places. Because the reproaching soul that He created for you is to show you how it's significant and important this level of the soul is. That, the soul that we talk about, the nafsul amara, is lowly. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he created your soul, he gave you this propensity for the soul to be upright. So this is a soul that that's like your default state. And when you go down to that other soul part, if you reach them depths of that part, then it's like you become like an animal. You're uncouth. You don't listen to nothing, and it's going to take something. For most people who are in that state, it's going to take something drastic for them to happen for them to realize that they need to, get themselves together. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is very important. He swears by the soul that is reproaching, lawama. All right, the blaming soul. The words comes from blaming. The soul that is able to recognize its blameworthy traits and be, remorseful about it, and is up to a next level of trying to refine it. So then there's this saying that says, it is said that all people except those who know will perish, and all those who know except men of deeds will perish, and all men of deeds except the sincere will perish, and all the sincere ones are in grave danger. This is a tremendous statement because it's telling you that the more you grow, and the more righteous you become, and the more you work on yourself, the more dangerous it is meeting Allah about sincerity, because, when you get to a level, you start purifying yourself, you have to be careful that the shaitan doesn't begin to manipulate you. And then you get this aura of self-righteousness and you think you've arrived. And then be careful that you're not looking at people with disdain because, you're not doing something no more. And you see other people doing it, how do you look at them? Instead of, because when we relieve ourselves of these vices and these caprices and these defects, we have to look at how can we help the next person. And every time we see a person, normally we see somebody astaghfirullah, how could they do that? But then when we look at our own soul, are we at a stage that we at least blaming ourselves? The times that we backbitten, the times that we gossip, the times that we treated someone unjustly, the times that we said a bad word, the times that, anything that we've done, this is what it means, the nafsul lawama, the soul that is reproaching, is blaming itself for its defects instead of just being, victims of it, all right? So, and the more sincere you become, the more you have to be wary of yourself. So that's a deep statement, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us to purify ourselves. I mean, so now we come to the next one, which is called the inspired soul. So the inspired soul is called a nafsul mulhimma. And so the level of this soul is that this soul reaches a station of wayfaring, which is called salute. So this soul starts to be on a journey towards righteousness because it has overcome the animal nature that is connected to the nafsul amara. And then, it's come past the second degree of the nafsul lawama, is past just blaming itself. So now, after you, just like if you beat yourself up about things you did wrong, it's supposed to prompt you to do things right. So now the inspired soul, after that cultivation and nourishment, a lot of vikr, So in another session, we're going to cover like some of the ways to get to these stages. So we just identifying the different degrees so we can know where we're at, or at least gauge where we are at a little bit, because, our soul is our biggest enemy, the one that sometimes we won't even put up a fight, and a lot of times the indications we're fighting against every other thing because we haven't conquered that one, So their soul reaches a station of wayfaring, and the one who reaches this station, that their sight falls only upon Allah, since the reality of faith has permeated them inwardly, and everything other than Allah has become extinct in their contemplative vision, basira. All right. So now think about this for a moment. This is just the third degree of the soul. We got 4 more to go, because, looking at this one, be like, okay, man, I've arrived, but this is how deep the soul is. وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلٌ. That's what Allah says. And what you have given of it of knowledge is just a little. All right. So some of his traits, are liberality, resignation, having knowledge, forgiving people, inviting them to rectitude, accepting their excuses, having a yearning, for the next life, weeping, restlessness, never settle because not knowing what your final destination is going to be, shunning the creation, just staying away from people, when you don't have any, it's not necessary to be around people, not just wasting time, the absence of fear or hope. The absence of fear or hope meaning here is that, they still have fear and hope, but either way, how it goes, it doesn't matter because their whole reality is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all that matters. And this part is a succession of constriction and expansion. And this is called qabd and bast. Qabd comes from Allah's attribute. He's al-qabid. He's the one who expands. He's the one who restricts things or constricts. And he is al-basit, that he expands. So what this means here is that a person, when their soul is at this level of suluk, they have a succession of things that are constricted and things that are expanding for them, and they see them like that. And it doesn't bother them because they have reached this purified stage that, that faith has permeated them inwardly. Because think about it sometimes, sometimes, good things happen to us and we are, we're patient, and then something bad, we fall apart. We have fear when it's immediate danger, but then we don't have hope when we're in the mix of something where we need to have hope, and this makes the possibility about, how people leave Islam, how people, stop praying, how people give up, how sisters stop covering, how brothers will stop, doing the right thing, and the soul will, depending on what level they're at, will allow them to make excuses for themselves, and and many of us, we never examined this science like this in any real sense because we've been spooked about it, and this is a living science, this is a lifelong occupation that we have to purify our souls. So some of these terms we mentioned here just as an introduction, but these are terms that are used in many circles of tasawwuf, like qabd and bast. Your whole life is either something it's being constricted, or something is expanded and open up for you. And it happens. Life is going to be up and down. Life is going to be up and down. Things will open up for you. Things won't go your way. But when you have fear and hope and that faith is permeated in you, it doesn't even make a difference because all of it, you have contentment, So, all right. All right. So the human soul, the next slide, the human soul is something that's strangely unique. All right. So, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives a proof about this soul that is Muhammad, the inspired soul. وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَاهَا فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا. So he said, by the soul and he who proportioned and inspired it with his discernment of wickedness and righteousness. So if you look in Surah Ash-Shams, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, throughout the entire Quran, he never swears by anything more important, because when we think about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he was talking about the soul in proportion and what he's been given it, it's a unique thing that Allah given us erect statures, and that we have the senses of sight and hearing and touch and taste and smell. And the animals have them too, but they are something that are unique when it comes to the human being. And the faculties of thinking and reasoning, the animals, they do in their own way, but they're not able to express them, having imagination and memory, discrimination, judgment, and willpower, all of these things, the faculties that Allah has given. This is what is meant by وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَاهَا, and by the soul and he who proportioned it, giving it all of these things that it needs, to operate. And then at the same time, he used this word for hamaha, mulhim that we're saying now, the soul that is mulhim, all right, that is inspired. Alhamaha fujuraha wa taqwaha. So then the other part of it is that we are given an unconscious mind with the concept that we know things that are morally good and morally evil, and that good and evil are moral acts and they are not alike, and we recognize them. We're pre-wired to recognize them. So you automatically know something that is immoral and then something that is righteous, and you recognize it as good. Even just think about the time before we became Muslim, or even we have any concept of right and wrong. We had an innate nature to recognize it, and that we are endowed with the ability to distinguish between good and evil naturally. So that's something strange. So then we're given a challenge to, tune in, to tie in with what part that we need, depending on what your level of inspiration is and what your level of purification is. That's where your soul will be. All right. So that's going to be the end of the slide. All right. I'm going to stop the share there. All right. So I hope I didn't really ramble on. But so those are the first degrees of the soul that we covered tonight, inshallah. So for those who weren't able to attend, please go back and review this and review the first one, inshallah ta'ala. And then we'll resume next week. We hope Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will accept this effort from it. And we hope that there's been some benefit. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive us for any mistakes. So inshallah, you enjoyed the session and you found it, something that helps you out. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for tawfiq. Ameen. So inshallah, I'll see you next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.